The cruiser Admiral Kimov is a Russian battle monster saved from scrapping. In general, we don't make iPhones in Russia yet. Yeah, we don't make our own LCD matrices yet. But we do a lot of things that those countries that make iPhones and LCDs can't do. But most importantly, we produce something without which our country would have been destroyed at worst and at best conquered, dismembered and turned into a colony. The best weapons in the world, and their entire nomenclature. Some might say you can't put armaments on a bun. I agree, you can't. However, without armaments, I repeat, our people may well already have neither a normal tasty bun, nor even a roof over their heads. But they would have had machine guns in their hands like the inhabitants of many African countries who had a lot of resources, but had nothing to defend their independence against Western colonizers. Why would we have machine guns in our hands? Yes, because the ancient strategy of divide and conquer has never been abolished. The entire territory of Russia would be a battlefield between the various peoples inhabiting it. Because it would be profitable for the collective West to have the peoples living on Russian territory fight among themselves, while the colonizers quietly siphon off our resources, hiring us natives for cents. That is why we always have to be at least half a step ahead of the West in terms of creating new weapons and in terms of timely rearmament of our army, so that they do not have any illusions that they can solve the issue with us by force. Over the past 6 months, NATO strategists, who previously shouted that they wanted to achieve a strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield, have become visibly saddened as they realize that our weapons are at least as good as theirs and that Russia will not lose. And today we want to tell you about the real monster of our Navy, the heavy nuclear-powered missile cruiser Project 1144.2, or LAN, Admiral Nakhimov, which had a very difficult fate, which entered into service in December 1988. Until 1992 it was called Kalinin. First, a bit of history. LAN is a series of Soviet and Russian multi-purpose nuclear-powered guided missile cruisers of the Far Sea and Ocean area built at the Baltic shipyard from 1973 to 1996. I will list the names Kirov, Admiral Lazarev, Admiral Nakhimov and Peter the Great. These cruisers were the largest in size and most powerful in armament, in the world of non-aircraft carrying warships and had no analogues in world shipbuilding. Originally it was planned to build 7 ships of this class, but the Soviet Union managed to lay down 4 and build 3, and the 4th, Peter the Great, was not completed until 1996. The fate of these cruisers was not easy. There were periodic breakdowns in the 1990s, and the first 3 ships in the series were retired from the fleet by 1999. After that, only Peter the Great, which is the flagship of the Northern Fleet, has remained in service until now. The other 3 cruisers were placed against the quay wall. Kirov and Admiral Nakhimov in Severodvinsk and Admiral Lazarev in Abrek Bay. They tried to repair and modernize them, but at that time, and it was the early 2000s, it took from 2 to 7 billion rubles to modernize just one ship. And probably because US-NATO relations were quite friendly at the time, nothing foreshadowed a new Cold War. And it was decided by the presidents not to spend such a huge amount of money, but to mothball the ships. Later it was decided to scrap 2 of them, Kirov and Admiral Lazarev, because, according to industry sources, their restoration and modernization would have cost more than building several modern ocean-going ships. But Admiral Nakhimov was lucky. In 2008, probably under the impression of the Munich conference, when it became clear to the country's leadership that a new confrontation with the West was inevitable, Putin decided on its deepest modernization under Project 1144.2M, which lasted about 10 years and has finally come to an end. As reported by TASS, this Russian combat monster will go on sea trials and state trials in May 2024. What will surprise potential opponents? Admiral Nakhimov? Heavy nuclear-powered missile cruiser, Admiral Nakhimov, of Project 1144.2M, or LAN, will receive 4th-generation weapons as part of modernization. All obsolete systems and complexes will be replaced by modern ones, which by their characteristics correspond to the appearance of the ship of the fleet's flagship. As a result of the upgrade, the ship will be equipped with Caliber and Onyx missiles and Surso hypersonic missiles. After modernization, Admiral Nakhimov will have a new armament, which will bring its strike and combat characteristics to a fundamentally new level. The cruiser is being transformed into a new platform for strike weapons. The ship itself and its other systems will also be upgraded, but the main thing is the weapons. It will be groundbreaking. Such armament was not available at the time these ships were built. Exact data on the number and types of missile weapons that are deployed on the cruiser are not yet available. But let's familiarize ourselves with what was written about it back in 2019 in the foreign magazine Military Watch. Once armed, the Admiral Nakhimov conversion will likely deploy more hypersonic missiles than any other class of surface warships, both in terms of the number of hypersonic missile classes deployed and the number of missiles on board. Capable of deploying more than 100 hypersonic missiles for both air defense and against enemy vessels. Augmented with powerful new sensor and electronic warfare technologies, the Kirov-class cruisers will be a very formidable asset for the Russian Navy to demonstrate power abroad. The warship's ability to threaten important enemy targets with hypersonic missiles at extreme ranges of 400 kilometers for aircraft and 1,000 kilometers for ships makes the Kirov-class cruiser a very potent threat wherever it is deployed. With such a combined power of strike weapons, our ship will be able to single-handedly confront the aircraft carrier strike group of the presumed enemy. And our enemies should clearly realize this, because American elites always act according to the principle of a good word backed by a loaded Colt is better than just a good word. And kind words addressed to them are understood only when they are spoken by us with a well-loaded Colt in our hands. And well-loaded Colts, as you can see, we have for them. We would also say that we are very hopeful that its twin brother, the ship Peter the Great, will undergo the same modernization, and then one of these two monsters will become the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. According to currently available information, after the return of Admiral Nakhimov to the fleet, the Peter the Great will indeed be sent for the same modernization. Now let's move on to the submarine fleet. Recently, the commander of the Norwegian Armed Navy compared the nuclear submarine Yasen to the erected USCG gun of the European Union. Why is it that NATO dislikes these unique ships so much? Yasen-M is a really unique boat and today has better armament than any classmate. It was from it that the Zircon hypersonic missiles were successfully launched twice already, and this fact was recognized by all military departments of the planet. The last few months have been rich in pleasant developments in military acquisitions for our armed forces and navy. But the end of November was somehow particularly heartwarming. Another multi-purpose nuclear-powered submarine 885M Yasen-M K-564 Archangels was launched. She became the fifth in a line of these ships, and such a grouping is already a serious force. And what is Yasen, or in NATO parlance the class, Severodvinsk, in the North Atlantic Alliance and naval structures of the USA and Great Britain know very well. It is perhaps the only domestic post-Soviet program whose effectiveness has never once been doubted or even attempted. The fourth generation of multi-purpose boats was developed in the last years of the Soviet Union and reproduced in metal in a completely different country. In the 90s, ruined with stolen military secrets and factories dark from lack of electricity. Projects such as the Yasen were, of course, a serious underperformance of US intelligence. These ships were already decades ahead of their time in the 90s and should have been the first target of all sorts of commissions and scrapping programs as part of the general détente. Détente and demilitarization in those troubled years took place in a very peculiar way. While we were cutting everything we could and couldn't, American factories were just stamping out everything that helps them keep many regimes on a leash today. But Project 885 has somehow miraculously managed to avoid the involvement of many promising developments. 1993, they even laid down the firstborn of the series. But it soon became clear that this was pure fiction. In the 7 years leading up to the new millennium of 2000, the project's debut ship was less than 5% complete. And then, when the US withdrew from the treaty, it became clear that in a couple more years such high-tech nuclear submarines would simply have to be forgotten. And by and large it is a real miracle that the first boat of the series was completed 17 years after it was laid down and entered service 20 years after construction began. The Americans didn't wake up until 2009, when Navy intelligence released an extended report that the Virginia multipurpose supermarines had a serious competitor in the East just 5 years after entering service. And with each passing year, US analysts became more and more convinced that this competitor turned out to be no less toothy than they're vaunted in all the world's publications. Their Virginia projects and even the mega-expensive Seawolf. For the last 3 to 4 years, the Yasen has been a big pain in the sirloin of NATO's naval staffs. There they are called ghost boats because of their unusual low noise performance for a nuclear submarine. Project 885M submarines began to appear in those points of the world ocean, where even Soviet submariners, with all the power of the Oceanic Navy, had no way out. I'm even tired of counting how many times high-ranking Alliance war sailors have whined about losing the Yasen once again. And it was sure to surface somewhere near critical undersea cables and major naval bases. or exploring near pipelines in the North Atlantic. Perhaps the most high-profile case occurred in the summer of 2021, during the 47th G7 summit, held near the Celtic seacoast of the UK. At that time, this action, which had a vivid anti-Russian tinge, was under the careful watch of sailors from the K-560, Severodvinsk, boat and its 32 high-precision missiles P-800, Onyx. And what is particularly frustrating for NATO is that this fact was not revealed until a year after the whole thing had passed. Seemingly at the highest organizational level. Here is the multi-purpose nuclear submarine Yasen-M in section. According to the British Naval War Journal, in the last 6 months alone, the insidiousness of Russian ash trees has been repeatedly mentioned by First Sea Lord Admiral Philip Jones, Director of Military Intelligence and Security Service of the Netherlands Janus Swillens, and many other persons who are not supposed to talk in vain, let alone praise the enemy's equipment. The Norwegians were the last to speak out this fall, saying they had spotted the boat several times near the so-called pipeline maze, the numerous pieces of offshore pipeline infrastructure in the North Sea that carry expensive Norwegian gas to the mainland. These are the kind of tracking stations that scan the waters of the North Atlantic near the traditional routes of long-distance cruises for our nuclear submarines. Recently, they have increasingly begun to disappear without a trace and blame ash trees, among others. And in November, the commander of Norway's Joint Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Rune Andersen, said another cable connecting the Norwegian mainland to the island of Svalbard had disappeared not long ago. This is the third such disappearance in the last 3 years. From the beginning in April 2021, the so-called Love Underwater Observatory, supposedly investigating seismic activity but actually busy detecting Russian nuclear submarines, disappeared. Then a year later, the first cable between Svalbard and the mainland, which also had a dual purpose, disappeared. And now we're talking about a third case. The brave Norwegian sailor called the ash trees a raised gun at the temple of European energy security and a source of constant tension for the well-being of European citizens. I want to sympathize with him, of course, but we won't do that. Norwegian combat swimmers may also be very likely to be involved in the explosion of the Nordic streams. And now, having opened Pandora's box, it's silly to be surprised that you're being answered in the same coin.